Hi, and welcome to the fifth episode of the How to Write an Essay tutorial series. In this video, we are going to discuss how to write an effective refutation, how to effectively and clearly address the most powerful objections to your argument, how to make sure that you are doing the opposite position justice and giving them a voice within your paper. Um, the first question that we need to ask or answer rather is why is it important if you are writing a paper that you give voice to the opposition? And the answer is quite simply this: you want to demonstrate to the reader that you have the ability to anticipate a potential objection against your argument. And by dismantling a really powerful objection to your argument, you are demonstrating the strength of your argument, and that builds credibility. If you can anticipate the objection that the reader himself or herself has, and then you dismantle it before them, that is wonderful. That's fantastic. So please make sure that you are thinking of, as you are writing any essay, what is something that might be said against my paper? What is like the biggest vulnerability, and address and seal up that vulnerability as best you can. Now, in the classical argument, general structure, we refer to the refutation as the refutatio. And the refutatio posits and winsomely explains potential objections to the argument. Now, for a paper that's short, like 1,200 to 1,400 words, like 5 to 6 paragraphs, you probably only have room to address one objection, and that's fine. If you had a much longer paper, like a longer research paper, you might have room to devote a couple paragraphs to refutation, but you need to explain what the objection against your argument is. And you want to present it winsomely. Be careful that you're not poisoning the well or engaging in straw manning. You want to make sure that you have the ability to charitably explain your opponent's position in a way that he or she would agree with. Secondly, the refutatio makes necessary concessions, right? We're not talking the hot dogs that you get at a baseball game. By concessions, I mean that you want to concede, you want to accept the truthfulness of certain aspects of your opponent's objection. You obviously don't agree with their objection. You don't think that their objection dismantles your argument. However, maybe there's something that your opponent gets right. There will be something that your opponent gets right. Maybe at least there's a concern that they have that's valid, and it's important that you validate those things, that you highlight what you agree with, what you sympathize with in your opponent's objection. That is seriously going to build credibility with the reader. And finally, of course, the refutatio needs to refute the objections. The second half of your refutatio paragraph should clearly demonstrate why the objection actually does not disprove your argument. I want to pay attention to uh, this argument really quickly. I know you've seen this thesis statement several times, but I'm going to read it again. And I want us to consider where someone might find a vulnerability in this argument. So the student is arguing that Abel is accepted due to his trust in God's promise and not his moral perfection. For Abel is presented in the New Testament as one who is counted righteous due to his faith, while Cain is presented as a spiritual forefather of hypocrites. So the student is arguing that it's not the mode of Abel's sacrifice. It's not Abel's sheer moral goodness that causes his sacrifice to be accepted, but rather it's his faith in God's promise compared to Cain's prideful, hypocritical approach towards the sacrifice that causes Abel to be accepted. And think of something that someone might say who has an issue with this argument. Are there any passages in scripture that seem to indicate that Abel was accepted due to the mode of the sacrifice? Is there anything that someone might say against this interpretation? And there are, and I want to highlight what the student wrote. So in the refutatio, the student wrote, however, someone might argue that framing Abel's acceptance as an example of justification by faith and not works ignores John's assertion that Cain murdered Abel because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. I'm going to pause there for a second. Notice that that topic sentence for the Refutatio is devoted to summarizing the objection to the argument. Do that with your Refutatio. The first sentence of your Refutatio should, number one, indicate that it's the opponent speaking here, right? Don't want to come off like you have some kind of split personality disorder. I refer to that as goleming, right? It's like you're acting like there are two people within your mind. Instead, say something like, however, someone might argue, someone might object to this position by asserting blank, so on and so forth, right? So this first sentence summarizes the objection. I will continue. Abel's sacrifice is clearly characterized as a righteous act, which seems to imply that he was accepted because of his good work. It is certainly true. Now, let me pause there for a second, actually. Notice that right after that topic sentence that summarizes the objection, there's a sentence that further explains that objection, right? So you're not just summarizing the objection, you're elaborating on it, okay? That was the summary of the objection there, those first two sentences. It is certainly true that Abel did a righteous deed when he offered his sacrifice. And furthermore, James teaches that faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. Notice what happens in the next couple sentences. This is the concession part. So the student is saying, yeah, this opponent, this objection, it holds some water. There's something in the concern that's right. Yes, Abel's sacrifice was a good deed, right? And it is true that Abel did a righteous deed when he offered his sacrifice. Furthermore, James teaches that faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. So the work was important. The moral status of the sacrifice was, of course, important. And making that concession seriously helps avoid the charge that this student is ignoring James or First John. And the student is saying, no, I embrace them. And look at what he says afterwards. But this does not mean that this good deed merited Abel's salvation. Other passages in Scripture clearly rule out this possibility. Paul writes that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God and are justified by his grace as a gift. The implication, therefore, is that Abel's good deed was an expression of his faith in God's salvation, much like Abraham's good deed of offering Isaac on the altar. As in the case of Abraham, Abel's faith was completed and validated by his works. But this was faith in a promise of salvation that no one but Christ could merit. Notice, right, how this student really leans into that concession and says, yes, like there are things that you're getting right. However, right, that doesn't nullify my argument. It is certainly true that Abel's deed was a good deed. It was good fruit that flowed out from his faith, that validated his faith, that completed his faith, to use the language of James chapter 2, right? But this doesn't mean that that sacrifice merited his salvation. It's clear that what was important was the faith, and that the good deed was an expression of genuine faith. So that was an example of an effective refutatio. Make sure that your refutatio paragraph does all those things. Begin with a topic sentence that clearly explains an objection, and then further elaborate on that objection. Make a concession, right? Highlight what you sympathize with in that objection, and then present your explanation of why this objection does not invalidate your perspective. I hope that that helped. I will see you in the next video lecture.